You guys have probably heard of the trope of Jekyll and Hyde, or at least of the book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I want to talk about this because it's actually one of my favourite books, but the trope can be quite harmful to certain groups. So let's go over this. The Jekyll and Hyde trope refers to cinematic or literary themes that involve an evil twin, or it was the same guy after all. An example of this could be within Buffy the Vampire Slayer with Glory and Ben. They both share the same body, but Ben is a good-hearted doctor, whereas Glory is an unstable deity. Or an even more direct version of this within Buffy the Vampire Slayer is when Xander has split himself into two. One is charismatic, smooth, and good at a lot of things, whereas Xander number 2 is clumsy and tends to make a lot of trouble for himself. So where does the Jekyll and Hyde trope come from, and why can it be harmful? Luckily we have SparkNotes. While I've read the book over and over, if you've read it yourself, you know it's actually in the format of a case study. Therefore it might be hard for me to exactly articulate what the hell is going on. SparkNotes. On their weekly walk, an eminently sensible, trustworthy lawyer named Mr. Utterson listens as his friend Enfield tells a gruesome tale of assault. The tale describes a sinister figure named Mr. Hyde, who tramples a young girl, disappears into a door on the street, and re-emerges to pay off her relatives with a cheque signed by a respectable gentleman. Since both Utterson and Enfield disapprove of gossip, they agree to speak no further on the matter. It happens, however, that one of Utterson's clients and close friends, Dr. Jekyll, has written a will transferring all of his property to this same Mr. Hyde. Soon, Utterson begins having dreams in which a faceless figure stalks through a nightmarish version of London. Yes, this is 1800s London, because as we all know, bad things always happen in 1800s London. Puzzled, the lawyer visits Jekyll and their mutual friend Dr. Lanyon to try and learn more. Lanyon reports that he no longer sees much of Jekyll since they had a dispute over the course of Jekyll's research, which Lanyon calls unscientific balderdash. I love that, balderdash. Curious, Utterson stakes out a building that Hyde visits, which, it turns out, is a laboratory attached to the back of Jekyll's home. Encountering Hyde, Utterson is amazed by how undefinably ugly the man seems, as if deformed, though Utterson cannot say exactly how. Much to Utterson's surprise, Hyde willingly offers Utterson his address. Jekyll tells Utterson not to concern himself with the matter of Hyde. A year passes uneventfully. Then, one night, a servant girl witnesses Hyde brutally beat to death an old man named Sir Danvers Carew, a member of Parliament, and a client of Mr. Utterson. The police contact Utterson, and Utterson suspects Hyde as the murderer. He leads the officers to Hyde's apartment, feeling a sense of foreboding amid the eerie weather. The morning is dark and wreathed in fog. When they arrive at the apartment, the murderer has vanished, and police searches prove futile. Shortly thereafter, Utterson again visits Jekyll, who now claims to have ended all relations with Hyde. He shows Utterson a note allegedly written to Jekyll by Hyde, apologising for all the trouble he has caused him and saying goodbye. That night, however, Utterson's clerk points out that Hyde's handwriting bears a remarkable similarity to Jekyll's own. For a few months, Jekyll acts especially friendly and sociable, as if a weight has been lifted from his shoulders. But then Jekyll suddenly begins to refuse visitors, and Lanyon dies from some kind of shock he received in connection with Jekyll. Before dying, however, Lanyon gives Utterson a letter with instructions that he not open it until after Jekyll's death. Meanwhile, Utterson goes out walking with Enfield, and they see Jekyll at a window of his laboratory. The three men begin to converse, but a look of horror comes over Jekyll's face, and he slams the window and disappears. Soon afterward, Jekyll's butler, Mr. Poole, visits Utterson in a state of desperation. Jekyll has secluded himself within his laboratory for several weeks, and now the voice that comes from the room sounds nothing like the doctor's. Utterson and Poole travel to Jekyll's house through empty, windswept, sinister streets. Once there, they find the servants huddled together in fear. After arguing for a time, the two of them resolve to break into Jekyll's laboratory. Inside, they find the body of Hyde, wearing Jekyll's clothes and apparently dead by suicide, and a letter from Jekyll to Utterson promising to explain everything. Utterson takes the document home, where he first reads Lanyon's letter. It reveals that Lanyon's deterioration and eventual death were caused by the shock of seeing Mr. Hyde take a potion and metamorphose into Dr. Jekyll. The second letter constitutes a testament by Jekyll. It explains how Jekyll, seeking to separate his good side from his darker impulses, discovered a way to transform himself periodically into a deformed monster free of conscience, Mr. Hyde. At first, Jekyll reports he is delighted in becoming Hyde and rejoiced in the moral freedom that the creature possessed. Eventually, however, he found that he was turning into Hyde involuntarily, in his sleep, even without taking the potion. At this point, Jekyll resolved to cease becoming Hyde. One night, however, the urge gripped him too strongly, and after the transformation he immediately rushed out and violently killed Sir Danvers Carew. Horrified, Jekyll tried once more adamantly to stop the transformations, and for a time he proved successful. One day, however, while sitting in a park, he suddenly turned into Hyde, the first time that an involuntary metamorphosis had happened while he was awake. The letter continues describing Jekyll's cry for help. Far from his laboratory and hunted by the police as a murderer, Hyde needed Lanyon's help to get his potions and become Jekyll again. But when he undertook the transformation in Lanyon's presence, the shock of the sight instigated Lanyon's deterioration and death. Meanwhile, Jekyll returned to his home, only to find himself even more hopeless and trapped as the transformations increased in frequency and necessitated even larger doses of potion in order to reverse themselves. It was the onset of one of these spontaneous metamorphoses that caused Jekyll to slam his laboratory window, shut in the middle of his conversation with Enfield and Utterson. Eventually the potion began to run out, and Jekyll was unable to find a key ingredient to make more. His ability to change back from Hyde into Jekyll slowly vanished. Jekyll writes, even as he composes his letter, that he knows that he will soon become Hyde permanently, and he wonders if Hyde will face the execution for his crimes or choose to kill himself, which Jekyll notes that, in any case, the end of his letter marks the end of the life of Dr. Jekyll. With these words, both the document and the novel come to a close. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was first published in 1886, written by Robert Louis Stevenson. He had long been intrigued by the idea of how human personalities can reflect the interplay of good and evil. He was only a teenager when he developed the script for a play about Deacon Brodie. Deacon Brodie was a Scottish cabinet maker, deacon of the Trades Guild and Edinburgh City Councillor, who had a secret life as a housebreaker, a person who breaks into houses, which was partially for the thrill and partially to fund his own gambling habits. Apparently, he found the inspiration for his first 2 to 3 scenes while he was asleep, according to his wife. In the small hours of one morning, I was awakened by the cries of horror from Louis. Thinking he had had a nightmare, I awakened him. He said angrily, "Why did you wake me? I was dreaming a fine boogie tale." I had awakened him at the first transformation scene. While the direct interpretations of the story can be numerous, many people see it as an allegorical tale talking about the duality of human nature, between good and evil, human versus animal, civilization versus barbarianism. This was the 1800s, so you might have to just take that with a pinch of salt as to what barbarianism means. It's also been paralleled with Freudian theory, the idea that the thoughts and desires are essentially banished to the unconscious part of the mind in order to keep the behaviour of the conscious mind being socially desirable. Singh and Chakrabarty, a study in dualism, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, notes that a work ahead of its time, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde can be seen at various levels. As a story, it talks about the concept of good and evil that exists in all of us. At another level, it is a critique on the hypocrisy and double standards of the society. It's also an interesting study into the mind of the author and into the theories of dualism. Finally, it can be seen as a remarkable study into human psychology that presaged the structural personality theories as detailed by Freud. It's also been criticised for the point of Jekyll versus Hyde. For example, Patnick describes the idea that Hyde is not necessarily evil. The original is a much more complicated take on the nature of evil, society, shame, and repression than any that have followed it. Overall, the original work and its intentions is a lot more complicated than a simple trope, analysing many different themes from society, shame, and social desirability. As an allegorical tale, it's quite frankly revolutionary, preceding many different psychological theorems. Alas, many of the modern takes drawing upon the idea of Jekyll and Hyde can be quite stigmatizing towards people with certain diagnoses such as DID and OSDD. Anyone seen Split? While it's pretty much impossible to interpret a text in the wrong way because there are many different perspectives, it's important to note the very large distinction that Jekyll induced his own duality. Those with the diagnoses of DID and OSDD do not induce their own duality or their own pluralism. It is traumagetic. When looking at the text in comparison to these disorders, the only thing I can find similar is the feeling of loss of control. Jekyll expresses that he feels like he is losing control, which could be a parallel to those who are simply experiencing the disorder and symptoms for the first time, where they haven't coped with it or they haven't treated it. The closest thing that I can interpret in regards to Jekyll and Hyde and these disorders is how one may feel if untreated. I can't find a direct parallel between the duality of Jekyll and Hyde and people who experience alters, who have alters, who are part of a system. So what I can conclude from this particular segment is that it is the trope that is harmful and not necessarily the source material. Outside of the idea of induced polarity, which is not a thing, the idea that it is inherently good versus evil is also a thing that may have been interpreted from the original text. And again, we have seen interpretations that argues that Hyde might necessarily be a monster and is only partially put up to that because of the certain time and place he was in, whereas in certain cultures, certain times, certain places, he wouldn't be perceived to be a monster. Which again comes up to the fact that morality is subjective and not objective. For example, 200 years ago, the idea of women voting would have been abhorrent, whereas today in the United Kingdom, women can in fact vote. So instead, I'm going to have to interpret this trope through a modern lens of what evil looks like. And again, we're going to have to refer back to Split. From this example, we have 23 dominant personalities within the protagonist until his 24th is unleashed. The Beast. The Beast, who has supernatural powers and can be argued to be, at least by our perspective, evil. The 24th personality is described as sociopathic and cannibalistic, which shows a direct divergence from the original text, and which is why it's a trope and not referring to the actual text. The text was based on duality. This is meant to commentate on dissociative identity disorder. I don't even think I have to tell you guys why it's a problem to have an alter that's sociopathic and cannibalistic, but here we go. As we know through studies, people who have experienced trauma are more likely to put themselves in situations that will re-victimize themselves rather than become perpetrators. People with DID and OSDD and other plurality disorders aren't more likely to be the beast or have an alter that is the beast. They're more likely to put themselves in vulnerable situations again. From what we know about evolutionary psychology, the brain is programmed to protect the body. The brain is programmed to protect itself. It is far more viable to push away potential threats or potential perceived threats than attacking them. It is far more viable for survival to avoid threats. Even people who don't have these disorders may find themselves shying away from certain situations or pushing certain people away because they don't feel safe. Or an alternative is to appease the potential threat, which causes re-victimization. Appeasing the potential threat, being comfortable with the potential threat. You either push them away or you bring them in close in order to appease them. That's how it works. It isn't necessarily a guarantee that you are going to have your best chance at survival by outright attacking somebody. And this can be seen with many different sufferers of past trauma. They'll either avoid situations outright or make themselves comfortable in the situations, hoping that they might be treated better, quote unquote. And so the Jekyll and Hyde trope, as well as the evil twin trope, which kind of ties into that, is totally unrepresentative of people who have these disorders. I've talked about literary interpretations of the text and the trope and certain examples of media that uses the trope within it. I don't want to speak overly too much on actual systems and what they experience, so I'll do my best to find some specific videos or posts on this topic and put them in the description below. I kind of hope I covered it well enough that it kind of explains the problem with this trope and how it diverges from the original text so far that it doesn't necessarily even make sense. But I guess everyone can have their own interpretations of something as long as it doesn't necessarily impact real people. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!